Hi, hello, welcome to the program. Today I have an excellent guest who has never joined me before, but I'm very excited to introduce his work to you. His new book is Fear is Just a Word, a missing daughter, a violent cartel, and a mother's quest for vengeance. The former bureau chief for the New York Times in both Mexico and Afghanistan. I'm really excited to share my conversation with Azam Ahmed about his new book. You're going to love this guy. He's an investigative correspondent for the New York Times who is absolutely brilliant and fascinating, and his new book helps explain what is happening in Mexico, why it is happening in terms of the drug trade and the drug cartels, their power, the corruption between them and the government through this riveting story of a mother who fought back against the drug cartels in Mexico. And it's so good and so important. My conversation with Azam starts at about 20 minutes into today's program. If you're one of those creeps who likes to skip the news segment that I work so hard on. If you're not, then let's talk about what's going on in the world over the weekend. It's time for the news segment here on Stand Up that I produce each and every day. Cannot do it without your support. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic is where I'd like you to go if you haven't gone before. And you can always upgrade your subscription and pay more. That's what makes the show go and work. And that is what I am doing here. So thank you very much for that. I hope that you heard my conversation with the ladies from The Hue that I dropped over the weekend. A lot of great feedback on that. My conversation with Karen, Kimberly, Francis, and Vicky. Always great. Loved it. And I've got some great plans for you this week, as always. But always want to hear from you. What do you like? What do you not like? Who do you want to hear more of or at all? Great suggestions coming in to standupwithpete@gmail.com. Please use that email. Best way to get a hold of me if you're a subscriber. Hope you're hanging out on the Discord chat platform as well. All right, let's take a look at what happened over the weekend. Oh, what the hell is that? A little sound effect? All right. Okay, I'll try it. The Israel-Hamas war continues to bring horrifying headlines. Power, water, and medicine are running low in Gaza's main hospital, Al-Shifa, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Al-Quds Hospital in Gaza City is, quote, no longer operational, according to the Palestinian Red Crescent, which is the equivalent of the Red Cross, in case you're wondering. They have the Red Crescent there. My brother actually was a volunteer as a medic on an ambulance there in the West Bank in 2001. Pretty interesting story. I'll have to get him to tell sometime. An estimated 300,000 people marched through London in a pro-Palestinian demonstration over the weekend. Thousands of Israelis gathered in Tel Aviv to urge the government there to do more to rescue the hostages captured by Hamas. And during the October 7th terrorist attacks, Hamas assailants apparently sought out bomb shelters where Israelis were taking refuge, according to the New York Times investigative journalism article over there. A lot more headlines, but I'm skimming through as I always do here, but a lot more obviously going on there, and I'll be talking with people this week about that, I'm sure. Over the weekend, Speaker Mike Johnson pitched House Republicans on a plan to avoid a government shutdown that is going to happen as soon as, I think, Friday of this week. Former disgraced President Donald Trump apparently is quoting Hitler now with his plan to deport millions of people each year if he wins the next election as part of significant expansion of the hardline immigration policies of his first term. I'll play a little bit of audio around that coming up. In Iceland, authorities evacuated a town of about 4,000 after earthquakes that herald a volcanic eruption. Terrible news over the weekend because it was Veterans Day, and I know I didn't say much about that. Thank you to all the veterans listening to the program. I appreciate all those who served the country, not only in the military. I think there should be national service that potentially should be mandatory, like the Peace Corps or the Climate Corps or anything else like that. Anyway, terrible news that 5 American service members were killed in an accident, a crash Friday after their helicopter had some kind of an issue during a military training exercise in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. The Department of Defense reporting on Sunday. Tough news, of course, on Veterans Day weekend. Oh, by the way, different messages from the current and former president on Veterans Day over the weekend. Both President Biden and Donald Trump took to social media Saturday to mark Veterans Day. Very different messages. November 11th, of course, once known as Armistice Day, the anniversary of the ceasefire that ended war in 1918. President Biden posted on social media, today we honor the story of our veterans, the story of a nation at its best. On Veterans Day, let's recommit to fulfilling our one sacred obligation as a nation. Not kidding around. Wow, it's weird that he wrote that. he didn't, to prepare those we send into harm's way and care for them and their families when they come home. All right, well, that's a pretty appropriate message from the current president on Veterans Day. Also delivered an address at the Memorial Amphitheater in Arlington National Cemetery, where he paid tribute to, quote, those who have always kept the light of liberty shining across the world. Trump, on the other hand, he marked Veterans Day with a message on his Truth Social platform that said, to our heroic veterans, I'm very grateful to your service to our country and honored to wish you a happy Veterans Day. And then added, there is no greater act of selfless service than defending America's God-given freedoms and liberty. Several hours later, though, he returned to Truth Social with a little different message where he wrote, in honor of our great veterans on Veterans Day, we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, lie, steal, and cheat on elections, and will do anything possible, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and the American dream. The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within. Despite the hatred and anger of the radical left lunatics who want to destroy our country, we will make America great again. So the Midas Touch liberal outlet on, all platforms said that Trump's words were reminiscent of Adolf Hitler, that he was casually channeling Adolf Hitler on Veterans Day. Journalist Bill Gruskin wrote, it was a paragraph for readers who can't handle the subtle nuances of Hitler's Mein Kampf. Prem Thacker, a reporter at The Intercept, wrote that Trump echoed Hitler, who said communists and Jews were Germany's enemies within. And presidential historian Michael Beschloss wrote, today, in honor of our great veterans, ex-president demands on social media to, quote, root out communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country. Please tell us if this reminds you of any earlier historical figure. Trump spokesman Stephen Chung told Newsweek that these liberal idiots who are making this disgusting claim are racist and despicable. The Biden campaign also brought up statements that Trump had reportedly made disparaging veterans and, of course, soldiers killed in battle, saying if you don't respect our troops, you can't lead them. Of course, Donald Trump infamously has said so many terrible things, from John McCain and George H.W. Bush, who he said he liked people who didn't get captured, soldiers, airmen who didn't get captured. Remember that one? Of course, Trump made horrible remarks about veterans, dismissing dead soldiers as suckers and losers. I just can't imagine saying anything worse, but somehow many, if not the majority of veterans, still support the disgraced former president. A couple more headlines. Yesterday was the celebration of Diwali, the South Asian Festival of Lights. This week, coming up, President Biden and Xi Jinping will meet in California at the APEC conference. And so that's a pretty big deal. That's a Wednesday. Winners of the National Book Awards named on Wednesday as well. The deadline to avert a government shutdown is this Friday, so you'll be hearing a lot about that. That is what's coming up. Those are your headlines. Now let's get to a few of my favorite clips from over the weekend. Of course, a lot going on. Cable news, political media on the Sunday shows, as well as the comedy shows. You had Real Time on HBO, Saturday Night Live, and last night, although I'll be done producing this before it comes out, the show I work on last week tonight on HBO did an amazing deep dive into Israel, Gaza that must not be missed. And I'll try to share clips from that tomorrow if I can remember, but definitely go watch that. Let's start, however, with CNN's State of the Union. Dana Bash had the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on, and she pressed him why he hasn't publicly accepted responsibility for the national security failure that allowed Hamas' October 7th attack to happen.
Prime Minister Netanyahu, before I let you go, I know you've been asked this several times, but I have had multiple people inside Israel reach out to me knowing that I was going to interview you and say the one thing they want to hear from you is that you take personal responsibility for failing to prevent the October 7th attacks and protecting your people. I know you say the time for that will come after the war. Why won't you take responsibility now?
I've already addressed that many times. And I said this whole question will be addressed after the war.
Why
just
not
as people
now?
would ask, well, did people ask Franklin Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor that question? Did people ask George Bush after the surprise attack of November 11th? Look, it's a question that needs to be asked.
I think
and
those questions were asked.
And I've said that one thing that is important is, and I've said we're going to answer all these questions, including me. I'm going to be asked tough questions. Right now, I think what we have to do is unite the country for one purpose alone, and that is to achieve victory. That's what I did. We formed a unity government. The country is united as never before. And I think that's what we have to pursue. And what the people expect me to do right now is two things. One, achieve this victory and bring the hostages back. And second, assure that Gaza never becomes
And to Israelis who are disappointed that you still won't take responsibility, you say?
Well, I said that I'm going to answer all the questions that are required, including the questions of responsibility. There'll be enough time for that after the war. Let's focus on victory. That's my responsibility now.
All right. Well, there's the prime minister who is embattled, to say the least. And I saw this clip flagged by our friend David Rothkopf. This is Alan Pincus. He had advised four foreign ministers of Israeli foreign ministers. He's Israeli. He was on MSNBC. Yasmin Vesuvian asked him about Bibi Netanyahu and whether or not he should resign.
I want to read one more part of a piece that you wrote, specifically about the partner that the president has in Israel, and that is the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying this: there are clear signs that Biden wants to move forward beyond the war, identifying diplomatic silver linings. For that, he needs an Israeli partner to be at least in sync with the U.S. That is not the case at this point in time. Were you referring to the prime minister, and do you feel as if it is necessary for him to step aside for Israel to move forward and for Gaza to move forward?
I think he should have resigned after an hour, and then a day, and then a week, and then a month. But, it was unrealistic, apparently. If he had the decency and the integrity and the sense of accountability and responsibility, rather than tell one of the American networks with which he interviewed last night that no one asked FDR to resign after Pearl Harbor, that's nonsense. It's like saying, so Nixon didn't resign after Watergate. He is not the partner that the United States is looking for. But forget the United States for a second. He is not the man that should be leading Israel at this point. And this is already reflected in a multitude of polls and surveys.
All right. Well, there you go. Alan Pincus on MSNBC. Let's stay over there at MSNBC where Jen Psaki, president's former spokesman, hosts a pretty smart show. And she had this to say about those of you that are, concerned, hesitating to vote for Joe Biden.
Guess what? Joe Biden isn't perfect. No candidate is, by the way. But we have to understand what the alternative is here. If elected to a second term, Donald Trump would prosecute anyone he deems an enemy, unleash troops on protesters, and essentially unravel the rule of law as we know it. And this time, he plans to line his administration with people who will actually help him do it. But sure, Joe Biden is 3 years older and occasionally trips over things. Look, there's a lot to be concerned about right now when it comes to a second Trump term. The speeches are getting much more disturbing and much more unhinged, and we should all hear it that way. It's also important to talk about all of this and important to call it out. But there is nothing more important than digging into his actual plans. The faintest of silver linings here is that Trump is warning us in his own voice, with a microphone on and a camera rolling, by the way. He's telling us exactly what he plans to do. We all just need to listen.
And we are over here at Stand Up, so that's good commentary. Also, I think it was Allison Gill who tweeted, do you really think that these corporate media outlets would continue to exist if Donald Trump got reelected? Yeah. Bye-bye, MSNBC is certainly what a lot of people think. I don't know how that could be done, but worth considering. I'm pretty sure the experts on authoritarian history, like Ruth Ben-Ghiat, have been warning about that kind of thing for a really long time. I thought this was interesting. The head of the Republican National Committee, Ronna McDaniel, was on Meet the Press with Kirsten Welker and had obviously a lot to answer about last Tuesday's elections, where Republicans got creamed all over the country, except for in my town. On the issue of abortion, this is her terrible, no good, definitely failing message. I'm glad that she is pushing it.
This isn't true. Listen, I'm proud to be a pro-life party, but we can win on this message. The American people are where we are, and they want common sense limitations. They want more access to adoption. We want to make sure that there's pregnancy crisis centers. These are things we can win on, but we have to talk about it, and you can't hide in a corner and think abortion's not going to be an issue.
Okay, a pregnancy crisis center, of course, are these crazy Christian facilities. Number one, they aren't pregnancy crisis centers. She almost said Americans want more access to abortion because she knows that's the truth. But by all means, go for it. Go out there. Get out there and promote your anti-abortion policies. I think it's going to be really good for you guys come next year. All right, well, that's most of the serious stuff. I did want to play this from Chris Wallace's show. Is it on CNN or HBO or whatever? Anyway, he had the legend Barry Manilow on. I know there's a lot of Barry Manilow fans out there, and my mom is one of them, so I thought I'd share this thoughtful clip.
You married your high school sweetheart. You were married for about a year. That's not how you ended up. So how did Barry Pincus, married to a woman, evolve?
Music did it. We had a very nice marriage. It was great, but I was away every night making music, as a young musician would be, and it wasn't good for me, and it wasn't good for her. I couldn't be the proper husband. Well,
at that point, did you know you were gay?
Yeah, we all do when we're 5 years old or something. But I was very happy being married, and I really did love her. But the gay thing was pretty strong. It was strong. I couldn't deny it.
In 1978, you met Gary Keefe, who became your manager and is now your husband. I understand everyone's coming out story is different, but you didn't officially announce all this until 2017, and I wonder why it took so long.
I think it was a non-event for me. Really, Gary and I have been together for so long. It just never dawned on me that we were going to come out. But when we got married, it was a big deal. So we did. Gary actually kind of saved my life, because as my career exploded, as I said, it was crazy. It was just crazy. And, going back to an empty hotel room, you can get into a lot of trouble if you're alone night after night after night. But I met Gary right around when it was exploding. And I didn't have to go back to those empty hotel rooms. I had somebody to cry with or to celebrate with.
And also to explode with. I'm sorry. Thought that was interesting, and I wanted to share it, and then I ruined it. So let's go to Saturday Night Live and let the boys from The Weekend Update, Michael Che and Colin Jost, bail me out on that one.
The third Republican debate was held this week, and Vivek Ramaswamy started by saying that the GOP had become a party of losers. Weirdly, a party of losers was also how NBC advertised the debate. Ramaswamy then criticized rival Nikki Haley's daughter for having a TikTok account. He also stressed that it's not important how he knows her daughter has a TikTok account. Then Nikki Haley responded to the attack by saying, "Leave my daughter out of your voice," which was pulled directly from the Japanese subtitles of the Will Smith slap.
Ron DeSantis' presidential campaign got a major boost after Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds endorsed him. Also giving DeSantis a lift, his leather hooker boots. The FBI has launched a corruption investigation into New York Mayor Eric Adams by seizing 2 of his cell phones, one named Work Phone and the other named Shorties and Shady Stuff.
After new polls show Donald Trump leading Joe Biden, Democratic strategists are calling Biden's re-election campaign a 5-alarm fire, which is scary for Biden because in a fire, you have to use the stairs.
Oh, come on. He's falling down the stairs in this picture.
A new census report shows that by the end of the year 2060, 1 out of every 4 Americans will be Latino. That's how good Bad Bunny's music is.
Oh, I don't get that. I don't know what Bad Bunny is.
On Monday, Donald Trump testified under oath in his civil fraud trial, though technically he was never sworn in because the Bibles kept bursting into flames.
I like it. All right, there you go. Saturday Night Live Weekend Update. Be sure to watch Last Week Tonight with John Oliver on HBO, and hopefully I'll remember to play those clips tomorrow. All right, well, that's all I've got for you here in the opening news wrap-up, sound wrap-up. Hopefully you appreciated it. Shut up, Vicky. And she nails me every single time I misspeak, and I leave them in and don't edit them out because I welcome your jokes and ridicule here at Stand Up. Okay, my guest today is the first time he's been on the show, and he's an international investigative correspondent for the New York Times, the former New York Times bureau chief in Mexico, as well as bureau chief in Afghanistan. Brilliant guy who I loved talking to about his new book. It's called Fear is Just a Word: A Missing Daughter, a Violent Cartel, and a Mother's Quest for Vengeance. George Packer says about this new book, the great George Packer, from one of the best reporters of his generation comes this masterful portrait of nightmarish violence, endless pain, and great courage. Azam Ahmed shows us what Americans' insatiable lust for drugs has done to one Mexican family and town just across the border. And Steve Coll, the great Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist, writes, Azam Ahmed has written a page-turning mystery, but also a stunning, color-saturated portrait of the collapse of formal justice in one Mexican town. And so much more that I can say about it. But instead, let's just let the conversation speak for itself. Really happy to have Azam on for the first time. We really enjoyed this conversation, talked for a while after. Great guy, super smart guy, who's had an amazing career already. This book is so good. Let's do it. Welcome to the show, Azam Ahmed.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Before we get into the book and a little bit about your career, I just want to ask you one question that I think you're uniquely probably tailored to at least have a good informed opinion on, which is we're hearing a lot of Republican candidates for president talking, and others throughout the years, Trump often said this, talking about sending the United States military into Mexico. Specifically, they talk about sending special forces in to fight the cartels. You know the cartels as well as any American reporter, and you know American forces pretty well, too, having served or having been the bureau chief in Afghanistan and Mexico. My thinking is that the cartels are very dangerous and they're very well equipped. And if you send American special forces in, regardless of the horrific geopolitical scandal that would be, I think a lot of those guys, Americans, wouldn't come back. Seems like a dangerous mission. And for what?
What struck me when I heard that talking point, just sort of a standard saber rattling on the right when it comes to any sort of threat that they think will chin up the base. I mean, Mexico's been at war for the last 15 years. You know, the war on drugs was launched in 2006. And I'll give you two stats that pretty much sum up what I think about the idea of sending in U.S. troops. Since that war began, there are today more deaths and more in Mexico and more overdose in the United States than almost at any point since 2006. And that is with an approach that is predicated on violence. So what do we think is going to happen if we send in more people to commit more acts of violence? This is not an issue that's going to be solved by killing people, number one. Now, I don't know what would happen to U.S. SOF if they went into Mexico. It's a tricky environment, and there aren't front lines in that fight. Right. You're going to deploy to a place like Tijuana or Juarez or San Fernando, where my book takes place, and just wait around and look around for the bad guys and then go after them. And the Mexican Marines are already doing this, and they're already doing it at a pretty high level. The cartel fighters can't compete with the Mexican forces for the most part, but all it does is it's another spin on the roulette wheel. They're not, to summarize this sort of meandering response, this country has had a war on drugs that has been going on for now 17 years, and it has not worked. The idea that by doubling down on violence, somehow it's going to be better, or there's going to be fewer drugs. Well, if you believe that, then I think you probably think Iraq and Afghanistan went pretty well for the United States.
Well, you're talking about the war on drugs in Mexico, but the war on drugs in America is well over 30 years old. And how are we doing on that?
No, exactly. It's like this whole war terminology hasn't been great for us in the last.
Not in our lifetimes.
Not in our lifetimes. No.
So, this book tell me a little bit about your time as the bureau chief in Mexico for the New York Times. I mean, what is that work like? You wrote an article that this book is based on back in 2020, I believe, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what were you kind of covering and writing about? What were American and other international readers interested in from Mexico, where you were the bureau chief?
It's interesting. When I took that job over, I'd previously been the bureau chief in Afghanistan. And
what a boring life you've led.
I know. I have a type. And I started and I thought, you know what I don't want to do? I don't want to write about cartels. It is such a truism of of American journalism to write about cartels and violence in Mexico. And for a while, I avoided it because, I mean, when you move to a place, you want to have a thought about the place or the region. You want to have an idea, not just like, here's the news and here's the news. At least the way I look at the job with the Times and as bureau chief, it's what is it that you want the world to understand about this place that maybe they don't understand, maybe they don't quite grasp. And I feel like the world pretty well understands and in some ways synonymizes Mexico with cartels. And so what struck me most was the level of corruption and impunity that was going on in Mexico. The things I was seeing, the stuff the state was getting away with, it was astounding. And it kind of launched me down that trajectory of investigative work looking at government corruption, but consequential government corruption, not like they're stealing your taxes, but like they're illegally surveilling journalists, human rights activists, and their fellow politicians, anybody they consider in the opposition. And that, I did a series on that in 2017. That was all about the spyware called Pegasus that the Mexican government was kind of pioneering the illicit use of.
So tell me more about, you really piqued my interest on other examples of corruption.
So there was, as part of that whole series, I did a long story on the murder of journalists in Mexico. And it's been a recurrent theme in the years since, where the number of journalists in Mexico that are killed tops the, top lists of the world. And in some ways it's silencing dissent, but there's something even more pernicious, which is, or if not more pernicious, equally. And that is, they have these armies of bots that are deployed against anyone that is dissenting, period. So whether you're talking about a journalist or, again, an opposition member, suddenly they'll be getting dragged on social media and it'll go on for days. And if you talk to journalists, in particular Mexican journalists, they'll say, I don't even want to do this anymore. You're not assassinating people, you're assassinating their character, which is in some ways more disempowering for the others who are looking at that. When a journalist gets killed in Mexico, it's often in places that are a little bit more remote, often where there's plausible deniability because there's cartel involvement. But when there's a political reporter in Mexico City who has nothing to do with organized crime that suddenly is humiliated online day after day, nobody else wants to write about whatever it is they're covering.
I have a billion questions. This is hard to do, this interview in real time, because I have so many questions for you, and I want to, obviously get to the book and talk about the story and why it matters so much. But, it feels like corruption is the story, and it feels like, not knowing much, that the corruption really comes so much from the cartels themselves. Talk to me a little bit about the relationship and how it's changed over the past whatever period of time. I think you talk about recent times in terms of that push and pull between the corruption of the cartels and the actual national government, federal government, they call it, I think.
Yeah. One of the ideas of this book, and what I've kind of wanted to do, was understand how Mexico came to be so broken, right? How it came to be a place where a mother could be killed for the simple act of looking for her disappeared daughter, because there is no state, there is no government, there's nobody that's coming to the rescue, right? You're on your own. And the way that this story fit into that was, it's kind of like, okay, what's a story that people will find gripping? That I can write novelistically, that will have strong characters, be propulsive, but also I can lard all the things that I know and have learned over the course of 7 years covering Mexico into it, right? Like you call it the mule, right? This story is going to carry all the things that you want a reader to know and understand about Mexico. And your question is exactly what I was trying to answer.
Yeah, well, you did it, dude. You absolutely did just that. It's such an important book for that reason. I'm sorry to interrupt you. So go ahead and, get to a little bit more of it.
So part of it was, and there are people who have done this before me, but I went into the historic archives to kind of look at the genesis of the cartel that would come to take this young girl's life and then Miriam's life. And it begins as early as the 1920s and 1930s, and it begins smuggling alcohol into the United States during Prohibition, which is like quite a poetic irony considering what these cartels do today, the kind of violence it generates, and it's all about American prohibitions kind of generating violence and chaos and crime in Mexico.
Sure.
But this was also a really fragile period in Mexico, right? It was post-revolution. It had this 10-year fight to kind of reset the nature of corruption to some degree, but also equality, opportunity. And this one political party took over, and they didn't let go for 70 years. You know, a famous Latin American writer once called it the world's most perfect dictatorship because it looked like a democracy, it talked like a democracy, but in reality, the stage was set and everybody knew who was going to win, and the president was already decided well in advance of the election. But that operation kind of almost established something like a cooperative with the criminal enterprises working along the border, these smuggling entities that began with alcohol, but then kind of expanded into tobacco, car parts, any sorts of thing that could be smuggled north into the U.S. or south into Mexico. These syndicates were doing that in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. But it wasn't until the 90s that they realized, oh, wow, drugs are kind of the way of the future. The pipeline from Colombia through the Caribbean had been shut down, and Mexico suddenly became the DHL of illicit drugs getting smuggled.
Just to be clear, a lot of people, you know, you say the 90s, a lot of people know about the drug war or the drugs epidemic in America in the 80s. But that's, as you just referenced, I think it was somewhat subtle, though, Central and South America, not Mexico. I think that's what I heard you basically say. What? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, basically Mexico became in the 90s the new smuggling route. You know, it was routing through Jamaica, the Caribbean, you know, into Miami. And the drugs never stopped. It was just the route that they took. And in the 90s, they started to go through Mexico. And you already had this ready-built syndicate kind of criminal groups that could smuggle this stuff across this gigantic porous border. Now, the government was essentially empowering these people, kind of helping to appoint them, taking care of them, receiving millions and millions of dollars in bribes from them. So it was as close to like a joint venture as you can kind of come with the state. But the state was still separate. And at that time, the state was way more powerful because it was this sort of autocratic government, right? All powerful. What changed is in the late 90s and the early 2000s, democracy came to Mexico, ironically. And that meant that this one dominant party that had ruled since the 1970s no longer had the vice grip on control and power. And there was an inversion. Suddenly the cartels were more powerful than this fledgling government that was representative of multiple parties and people that didn't have the command and control that the older system had. And once that happened, and this is kind of where my book gets into the turn towards serious violence, they realized without a government institution sort of overseeing this or in some ways complicit with this, violence was the currency of power. You know, where before it was who could bribe the most officials, who had the closest relationships with the government, who could make sure that the police were defending their interests as well as the military. Now it was, they're not telling us what to do anymore. And essentially it is who has more guns and more men and more capacity to take territory and run the show.
What is the violence like in Mexico? Is it in all over the country? Is it centralized in different places? Are there some places that you don't see much of anything in terms of the presence of the cartels, much less the violence?
It's a good question. It's not general, meaning it's not every single place all the time. It is not discrete either. It's not just one or two places. It's in the places where cartels operate, and particularly where there are friction points between rival cartels or rival groups. It is where there are strong presence of cartels and the military goes in to take them on. So it's in the places you'd think, right? Tijuana, Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, the major border crossings, but then it's filtered throughout the entire country. So you're not seeing this kind of harrowing violence in every place, but you are seeing it in quite a few places. And we're talking about millions of people living under the kind of vice grip of this predatory violence.
And then they know it.
They know it. Yeah, they know. And what's worse is they not only know it, they know that nobody's coming to save them. They know that their government, their military, nobody's going to do anything to stop what's happening from happening.
Azam, is there any way to say what percentage of the market of the customers are American or other citizens of other countries, much less Mexicans? Like violence.
I'm sure that statistic exists, and I probably knew it at some point and have forgotten it subsequently. But the vast majority, Mexicans are not massive drug users. The drug abuse in Mexico is minimal. It is almost entirely the United States.
Wow.
Cocaine, meth, heroin, you name it. It's all going through Mexico. It's not It's not staying there for this market.
So what then?
Mexico's the last stop, right?
Yeah, I mean, what is then the point of view of the Mexican, if Mexicans aren't overwhelmingly buying the drugs and it's Americans and they see the market and they know why the cartels are able to exist, much less thrive, they must have thoughts, not to say that they're monolithic, but the thoughts about the demand from Americans for those drugs creating that violence, it must be pretty an interesting point of view.
I think they're pretty fucking furious. Am I allowed to curse on this?
No, unfortunately, I'm going to have to. Of course, no. I welcome it, and because that's what I thought you would say, but I'm not. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's upset on multiple levels, right?
Go ahead. Yeah.
On the one hand, your average person might not be thinking like, oh, well, these cartels are doing all this stuff just because the gringos have an appetite for coke. But that is the reality of their life, right? Like these syndicates, cartels, these federations, because some of them, it's not even, cartel is kind of a misnomer, right? Like there's a lot of different groups that are out there operating. It's not just some giant unit that's command and controlled by one guy necessarily. But the reason they exist is to service American drug demand. But what's worse is they send the drugs up there and then money and something else come down. And that something else are weapons. The kinds of weapons you can buy quite easily in the United States, where suddenly you've got 50 calibers on the streets of Sinaloa, firing at the local authorities. I mean, the kinds of
a 50 caliber gun, in case people don't know, is it's a machine gun and it shoots several rounds per second, I think. And you can
take out an aircraft with it in some cases. I mean, the rounds are gigantic.
They're serious weapons. It's not. I mean, we talk a lot about AR-15s and assault rifles in America, but we're talking about military grade, military grade weaponry that they get.
Exactly. These are not weapons.
Which is why I was insinuating about special forces. Like they're not up against. They're up against well-armed, as you said, people who've been at war with each other to some extent for years. So go ahead and tell me a little bit more about the cartel makeup, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's kind of a salient point relative to the sorts of people that our soft forces have been fighting is cartels aren't ideological. They're an economic force. They exist because there is a market that requires their existence.
Well, that's what I've thought for years, that Al-Qaeda, that the drug cartels of Mexico and other drug cartels, they're businessmen, they're not ideological, they're economic argument, therefore they're far worse people than ideologically driven religious fanatics. At least they have some kind of religious underpinning in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, whatever group you want to say, Hamas, whatever group you want to assign it to. In this case, these guys will slit your throat and drag your tongue through it because that's the best business practice.
Yeah, I mean, look, they are a part of a market, and that market is created by the United States. And unfortunately, because it's an illicit market, how is it regulated? It's regulated by violence. There's no SEC in there telling you, like, fining you if you don't uphold your drug deal, the terms of your contract. You get killed. And unfortunately, you also are in a country where the rule of law is extraordinarily fragile. And this is kind of where I come back to one of your initial questions or points was, the state in Mexico is responsible for a lot of this, just as the U.S. is responsible for the demand, because they don't have control over what's happening. They have weak and fragile institutions, politicians and, governors that are extraordinarily corrupt and allow for these things to happen. And there's a dearth of economic opportunities to pull people away from this market. And this market exists because it exists. It's not, it is the most capitalistic structure you can imagine. I mean, it's raw capitalism.
That's true in the streets of It's true in the streets of America with the same black markets. There's a dearth. There's not a job that you can make this kind of money in for a lot of communities, or at least that used to be the case. I hear I don't know today, but certainly that can be the problem. The opportunity lies in organized crime in Mexico and elsewhere. And I think what's fascinating and most, I guess, terrifying and depressing about your book is that the story, the central figures, are about people have to do with hostage taking and kidnapping. So we think so much about the drugs, but you're talking about like $1,500 or $1,600 ransom for the hostage, for hostage taking. I mean, it's terrifying, horrifying, and you write so eloquently and articulately about how awful it is. Tell me a little bit about that practice.
Yeah, I moved to Mexico and I started covering, as I was saying, corruption and impunity. And then it was like a sledgehammer. I just started finding out more and more about what they call the disappeared. To disappear is a tragic verb in the Latin American context in particular. It's basically to be disappeared. You are vanished. Someone abducts you and then you're never seen or heard from again. And was a widespread practice through the 70s and 80s. And a lot of these sort of rightist governments were taking out, dissidents and just they'd grab them, put them in a plane, throw them off the edge, and that would be it. You'd never hear from them again. But then the cartels kind of realized, well, on the war continuum, this is arguably the most efficient and cruel way to inflict damage on your enemy. Number one, because no body, no crime. So rather than leaving you in the street, I'm going to bury you in a mass grave in the middle of nowhere that nobody knows about. But it also inflicts this perpetual torture on the families because you just don't know what happened to your loved one, right? You wander the world as a broken human, a massive human ruin, because every time you think about something else, you're like betraying your child.
Oh God! Oh God!
Alive, it just destroyed me when I found out about it. And I wrote a story back in 2017 as part of this first project about this couple that had fallen in love while searching for their respective children as part of a collective. So they didn't know each other. They'd both lost children. And then in the process of joining this group that literally the sole purpose of their enterprise was to go out and dig holes in the middle of mountains to look for their children's remains, they fell in love. And so it was a love story born of this very dark and harrowing thing. But I was always looking for a way to write about what impunity really looks like, what it feels like, and the costs. And the story of Miriam was, you could write a million stories for the millions of cases of tragedy that inflict Mexico. But what connected me to her story was this idea that she tried to fight back. She fought back. She did that thing that every parent thinks they would do in the midst of the worst thing that could ever happen to them, which is something happening to their child, never mind someone disappearing their child. And the truth is, in the hundreds or thousands of people I've met who have had children disappeared, almost none of them ever go after the people responsible. Many of them will speak out. Many of them will go looking for their children, but they won't actually fight back. And Miriam did. And it was such a profound way to explore the trauma, the national trauma that is disappearance. Today, and this is the counted numbers, there are 100,000 disappeared in Mexico. 100,000 people who they have no idea what happened to. The true number, I'll tell you this, I don't know what the true number is, but I know that more people have not reported their disappearance than have reported their disappearance.
Right. Wow.
So 100,000 of the people who have raised their hand and said, yes, my loved one was disappeared. I can't even imagine what the actual number is. But her story, she was a mother of three. She sold cowboy boots in the local market of this small town called San Fernando. San Fernando is 70 miles from the United States. And for most of its existence, it's been a small cattle ranching town. Until the cartel that's at the center of this book, the Gulf Cartel, split. And the reason they split was the reason anybody split, sort of a relationship gone south within the cartel. This cartel, and the reason I kind of use them as a centerpiece of the book as well, is because they're iconic in a lot of ways. They were, as I described earlier, kind of some of the earliest smugglers during Prohibition, when the Volstead Act was in place and, Americans couldn't get booze. These guys were smuggling booze, tequila, and other alcohol up from Mexico. Later, as the country evolved, they kind of created this multivarious enterprise that could smuggle all sorts of drugs. And then when the politics changed, as I referenced earlier, and suddenly there was an inversion, the cartels became more powerful and violence became the new currency of power, another pioneering leader of this cartel decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to hire a bunch of Mexican special forces, some of them trained in the United States, and I'm going to make them my Praetorian Guard. And those were the Zetas. So the Zetas were a part of the Gulf Cartel. ZTA,
you're saying it with the correct pronunciation, but the Zetas, I think people have heard of. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the Zetas were the armed guard. And suddenly they became a military wing and they just dominated. And, like any market, these guys disrupted cartels. And so everyone else started following them and trying to do the same thing. And so even the government had to militarize their response because suddenly they were fighting their own soldiers out in the streets. That militarization created this incredibly powerful subgroup, the Zetas, that responded to the Gulf Cartel. And then the leader of the Gulf Cartel, who created the Zetas, he got arrested, extradited to the United States, and these two groups split. And that set off a war that would break records in Mexico and redefine the nature of violence in the drug wars, because these two groups would start fighting each other. And arguably ground zero for their fight, the place where it was the worst registered, was this tiny town of San Fernando, where Miriam Rodriguez was from, where she'd grown up, which used to be a cattle ranching town. It was a population of about 20, 30,000 people. And the reason is it's geographic misfortune being at the center of one of the most prominent border states in Mexico.
Right.
There's multiple roads that route through that. And so if you're a cartel and you're trying to choke off another cartel's access to the U.S. border, the goal line for whatever you're trying to smuggle north, this is the village/town you want to take. And so in 2010, the Zetas, trying to disrupt the flow of, I mean, this is so dark, but they were smuggling migrants north to disrupt their merchandise. They killed dozens of migrants in one single day and left them in a warehouse. The equivalent of burning a truckload of drugs, only it was human lives. People who were trying to make it up to the north for a better life for themselves and their families. The following year, they discovered hundreds of bodies in mass graves buried all around this tiny little town. So this is the context of what San Fernando was when Miriam's daughter was kidnapped a few years later in 2014. And it happens, and it's at a point where kidnapping is so common as a means for the Zetas to fund their war that the local banks offer loans for ransoms.
Jesus.
Think about that, like a bank knowing their customer so well that they realize a line of business for them is to loan money to pay ransoms for kidnapping.
Wow. And those ransoms are low numbers than what you think kidnapping. You think, well, the only reason you would kidnap somebody is because they've got a lot of money. That seems like a pretty risky crime to commit. But in this case, in this town, it was, I guess, mass volume.
Yeah. I mean, it was hundreds of dollars sometimes, maybe a few thousand. I mean, it was, and this is also another thing that I really tried to focus on in the book, because I focus on the people responsible as well, and not to demonize them, in some ways to create portraits that are realistic, that make you understand the true desperation and depredation.
Yeah, you do an excellent job at that, at giving contour and texture to the actual people and not just make them white and black hats or good and bad guys, I guess. Thank you.
I mean, because the thing is, and to get to your point or what we were talking about before, these are subsistence gangsters. These aren't people walking around with gold-plated AK-47s, like drinking Armagnac out of like chalices. Like these guys are living in, they're living in shitty hotels. They're like driving around beat up cars. They are killing for next to nothing. And so, obviously, even when you're not trying to glorify organized crime, television shows, books, all kinds of things, there is an element of glorification because you need, as you said, the black hat. But in reality, it's just utter misery these people are living, and they're sowing, their broken lives are breaking more lives as they sow misery throughout the entire country. And Miriam's story was kind of a vehicle to get into that world, to get into the specifics, the details of what it looks like, why it happens, what the people who stay, who aren't migrating, face on the front lines of this conflict that is generated by the U.S.'s insatiable appetite for drugs.
Very well said. Miriam Rodriguez was a 56-year-old woman. Her daughter, Karen, was kidnapped. And unlike most people, as you said, she did everything she could to fight back and to find her daughter, and made that her mission. And you wrote this amazing article back in 2020 telling the story, and now the book, which goes deeper into the issues, the problems that the country faces as a result of all of this, kind of using her story. Tell me a little bit more about her, and everybody needs to get this book and read it just to try to begin to understand the humanity or the lack of humanity down as a result of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I realize I haven't introduced the main character.
That's my bad.
Properly. No. I'm talking too much. She was, as you said, a 56-year-old woman when her daughter, Karen, was kidnapped by this cartel, the Zetas.
How old was Karen, a teenager?
Karen was 21. She was young, right? She was a young woman.
Do they target women? Do they target a type of person?
They target anybody. Yeah. I mean, they target anybody that they think has a pressure point where they can extract some kind of remuneration for a kidnapping. And at this point, again, these cartels are desperate for whatever sort of pennies they can vacuum up in their broader war with their rivals. So Miriam finds out about this kidnapping. She does everything they tell you have to do. She doesn't call the cops. She pays the ransom. She pays another ransom. She even pays a third ransom. And then one day, after like pining for her daughter, and actually, at one point she meets some of the cartel members.
Crazy.
And
it's a crazy story.
They extract another bribe from her saying, oh, yeah, I'm familiar with your daughter. I'm going to get her out. Just give me another, $1,000. So she does this. And then one day she's sitting in her room and she's just broken. She's been distraught for months and something clicks and she walks downstairs and she sees her other daughter, her oldest daughter. And she says, I know my daughter's dead. I know Karen's dead. I know it in my heart, even without seeing her body. And I don't know how much life I have left, but with whatever they get, whatever life God gives me, I'm going after every single one of these motherfuckers and I'm going to make them pay. She leaves the house that day and starts this campaign for vengeance, justice, but also for vengeance, because she's not going to really get justice, right? She knows that. And so she partners up with this Marine who she has met through a chance encounter. And this Marine basically becomes her sword. And she tracks some of these folks down to a ranch. And the Marines do what the Marines do. They launch a raid and kill everybody. After that, she decides, okay, maybe I don't want to kill everybody, but I am going to go after these people and put them in prison. And she finds another 9 of them and has them imprisoned by investigating them. She does stakeouts at
one
night.
At a time.
She wears disguises. One by one, she tracks them down. She puts on disguises. She dyes her hair. She pretends to be a pollster just so she can get the name of one of these guys in a neighborhood that she knows he lives in. She breaks into their home. She does all these extraordinary things to track these men down and women. And then ultimately, on Mother's Day, after she's put all these people in prison, the same cartel assigns a group of men to kill her in front of her home on Mother's Day. And you couldn't make that up.
On purpose, do you think?
Oh yeah. I mean, that wasn't chance. I mean, if you think about
that's evil,
it's a perfect metaphor, right? Of the impunity. It's like if you couldn't make it up to kill a mother on Mother's Day for her quest for vengeance after having taken her daughter, the most precious thing in her life.
The book is so important and fascinating, and so is this woman and so many other people who find purpose in the most darkest corners and in the strangest of ways and pursue it. But it's a whole different world than I think most Americans have no idea about it. And it's on our southern border. And more importantly, in many ways, we are responsible for it, if not buying the drugs, supporting the policymakers who haven't really made an honest effort to, I think, alleviate the issue. There's no way that I feel like it ever ends or solves it. Although maybe you think, or there are other real smart policymakers that can see some kind of a way. I mean, some people just argue you should just legalize all drugs and there would be less black market crime. You could regulate it and so on. But I mean, there still would be, I think these organizations would still be very active and criminal. I mean, probably, I don't know. What are your thoughts about what, if anything, policies or policymakers, whether it be in Mexico, the U.S., or anywhere else, could do differently if possible?
It's a good question. It's one I always struggle with because, I mean, first off, I think to answer the smaller question, what happens when you have created a criminal subclass predicated on something like drugs is that the origin no longer matters. If you legalize drugs, I think that group is going to metastasize and become something else. Maybe the money isn't going to be as good. Maybe the market isn't going to be as big, but it's hard once that genie's out of the bottle to suddenly take the ranks of thousands and thousands of people and be like, well, you can't sell drugs anymore. It's like, cool, I guess we'll kidnap, or maybe we'll smuggle
human trafficking.
Yeah. We'll do something else. It might help, but I think it gets to a bigger point, which is this book was not meant to be prescriptive. It was not meant
fair
to
enough.
tell people what should happen. What it was meant to do is be presented to that smart policymaker and be like, hey, you know what? You probably don't know what it actually is to live this. You probably don't know what it looks like from the front lines. And I think we spend a lot of time telling policy, like suggesting policies, talking about things like we're the experts. I'm not the expert, but what I have done is gone in and go about as deep as I can to explain the symptoms of this disease and what it looks like and why it's happening. And I hope that people can take that and start to think in more humane terms about what's happening at our southern border, about the responsibility the United States has, not to the Mexican government, to the people of Mexico, for the pandemic of violence fueled by American guns and the pandemic of violence fueled by American drug appetites. There's a dark mirror reflection in what happens down there and what is happening in the United States. And I think my hope is not that people walk away with some idea about how to fix this, but a better understanding of what's wrong.
Or cognizance that it's occurring. I mean, for me, that's the most important thing, is that the country to our south, who we share a lot of culture with, who we, share a lot of history with, has this epidemic of violence and has for a long time. And it's directly connected to us. And yet we just go on about our days and not knowing about it. And I think, we talk about it all the time. If you don't know, you will know, I think would be one way of putting it. And
no, I think my editor and I thought about this for a while, too. It's like, how far is the United States from Mexico? When the rule of law starts to fray, when truth and things like that start to be manipulated and dictate the thoughts and actions of millions. This isn't just, in a micro sense, it is a story about Mexico and how Mexico came to be what it is, but it's the macro story of like the devolution of a state, the absence of a state, and what people do when they have no rear guard, right? They have nothing to defend themselves. And
how hard it is. And I don't know enough the history of corruption throughout human history, much less in recent times, but how hard it is once a country has become so corrupted to ever reverse that. I mean, you were the bureau chief in Afghanistan and Mexico. I'm guessing you know a lot about corruption in both those countries and how it works. And when you look at the U.S. and corruption here, it's what could be, is what it sounds like you guys are talking about. It's a warning of how much worse it could get, I suppose. No,
exactly. This is sort of the cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Of what a state and society looks like. Yeah. If there is no sort of floor placed on its descent.
Yeah. Well said. Fear is just a word. Azam Ahmed, is already award winner. I'm sure you will win more. Not that that's why you do this. It's such a masterpiece, and I'm really honored that you sat down to talk with me about it. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with your work at the Times and in future books. I hope people will go get it. Really grateful for your time today.
Oh, I'm so thrilled that you had me on. It's been such a pleasure to talk.
All right. Yeah, there he goes. Azam Ahmed. I hope you like that. He's a super smart, great, thoughtful, experienced, credible guy. And the book is real great, and I look forward to talking more to him about the issues in Mexico with drug cartels, corruption, how we are at the root of much of it. Fear is just a word is out and available now. I hope you'll go get it. I hope you'll follow him, support him on social media. All the links in today's show notes, as there are all of my guests. Thank you very much for listening to today's show. Also, posted a conversation today with Mara Quint that is relevant and thoughtful and real smart and funny, as always, Mara Quint. So look for that. Listen to the ladies from The View and a whole much more coming up this week, because I post each and every day a new show and stand-up. Can't do it without your support. Go write a review on Spotify, iTunes, subscribe on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok at Pete.Dominic, as well as everywhere else. All those links in the show notes too. John Carroll writes the music for this show, takes us in and takes us out each and every day. JohnCarroll.org. Go support him, see him live, buy his music at JohnCarroll.org right now. Bye-bye.
You got to rise up, you got to stand up, you got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience. Well, they'll begin to making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. This is the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it than now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well, and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up, got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the dark.